They left Ironhold before full daylight. No banners, no ceremonial escort, no public acknowledgement that the king's most dangerous secret had just been folded into a mission moving north of the western descent trails. The party was small by design. Captain Elian Rook rode in front, his horse sure-footed over the frozen shelf paths, his entire posture shaped by that particular kind of alertness practiced by men who stayed alive not because they feared danger more than others, but because they learned to recognize it before it found language. Behind him rode Belle, wrapped in dark winter layers beneath a traveling cloak, marked only with a muted crest seal hidden inside the lining. Kalin rode at her right, close enough that she could sense his attention even when he said nothing. Two hand-picked outriders followed at a distance wide enough not to crowd the trail, but near enough that no ambush would reach Belle unchallenged. It was not an army. It was a line of intent moving through cold. The northern route was worse than Elian had predicted. Ice had formed under fresh powder, making the rock beneath slick and deceptive. Twice the horses had to be brought to a slower pace along a narrowing ledge where one wrong shift could send stone fragments skittering into the ravine below. The mountain air grew thinner the higher they moved, carrying the metallic smell of snow and old pine. Every sound seemed to travel strangely. Hooves thudded too softly. Wind scraped too sharply across exposed stone. Even breath felt louder than it should have. Belle did not mind the cold. She minded the silence. Not because she feared it in itself, but because this was not the kind of silence she and Kalin had grown used to. This silence belonged to terrain, to distance, to the fact that all of them were riding toward something dead long enough to have become part legend, part evidence, and part wound. After an hour of hard ascent, Elian raised one hand. The column slowed. "There," he said quietly. At first, Belle saw nothing but broken white slopes, stone outcroppings, and a dark line of pines clinging stubbornly to the ridge. Then she noticed it, a distortion in the terrain that should not have been there. A half-collapsed terrace wall built into the mountain shelf. Too straight to be natural. Too ruined to belong to anything still meant for use. The recovery site, or what remained of it. From this distance, it did not look like a place where history survived. It looked like a place where the mountain had already made its judgment and swallowed most of what men had built upon it. Elian guided them down the final cut in the slope and signaled the outriders to hold the upper flank. Kalin dismounted first, then turned before Belle could move. For one brief second, the air between them held the argument they had postponed, rather than resolved. He had allowed this, but permission had not made the risk easier to bear. Belle met his gaze and dismounted without waiting for his hand. That was answer enough. The path to the structure had once been formal. Belle could still see traces of it beneath drifted snow, stone edging, worn steps, drainage channels cut with practical precision. It had not been a place of imprisonment. Not originally. It had been built for recovery, isolation, mediation. That somehow made what had happened here feel worse. Places designed for healing carried the memory of betrayal differently than places built for punishment. Elian crouched near the broken entry arch and examined the ground. "Recent disturbance," he said. Kalin's voice dropped at once. "How recent?" "Within a day. Maybe less. Not a large group. One rider. 2 on foot at most." Belle felt a pulse of cold move under her ribs. Not weather. Not altitude. Interference. Kalin drew his blade halfway from its sheath, not enough to gleam, only enough to clear motion. "Were you followed?" "No." Elian stood. "If I was, they were better than any tracker I've seen in the West." That was not reassuring. Belle looked past them toward the dark opening left by the collapsed entrance. Whoever had come recently might still be inside. Or they might have already taken whatever mattered and left the site as a hollowed shell. Either way, the past was no longer waiting politely. "We go in now," Belle said. Kalin's head turned toward her. Elian, wisely, said nothing. Belle continued before refusal could form. "If someone else came here after your signal, then every minute matters." Kalin held her gaze. The mountain wind caught loose strands of her hair and drove them cold against her cheek. For a second, she saw the entire calculation inside him, the terrain, the unknown intruders, the possibility that he had brought her here only to place her directly in the path of exactly what he had feared. Then, With visible effort, he gave one short nod. "Close formation," he said. "Bell between me and Elian. No one breaks line. No one argued." Inside, the recovery site smelled of damp stone, old timber, and time sealed too long without sunlight. The first chamber was half ruined, its ceiling caved in near one corner where snow had drifted through years of weather, but enough remained to show what it had once been. Shelving niches lined the walls. A central basin, perhaps once used for heated water or herb infusions, stood cracked through the middle. Iron brackets still held the ghost shapes of old curtains or partition screens. This had not been a prison. This had been a place where broken things were meant to mend. Belle stepped farther in. Something moved inside her. Then not memory exactly, but recognition without image. A sense that the proportions of the room, the angle of the inner corridor, the shape of the carved stone lintel beyond, had brushed some childhood fragment too early to name. She stopped. Kalin noticed instantly. "What is it?" Belle shook her head once, not to dismiss the feeling, but because words would have made it smaller than it was. "I don't know," she whispered. "Only something." Elian had gone ahead just far enough to check the second chamber. This way, they followed him through a narrow inner passage and into what had once been the archive room, or part of it. Half the storage shelves had collapsed, and one side of the room was blackened by old fire. But the fire had not consumed everything. Stone vaulting above had contained the worst of it. Near the far wall, a set of recessed compartments remained sealed under warped bronze covers. Belle's breath caught. Survival. Not complete. Not clean. But survival. Elian moved toward the compartments first, then abruptly stopped and crouched. "Trapwire," he said. Kalin was beside him in an instant. Belle stared. A nearly invisible line had been run low across the compartment handles and fixed to a rusted hinge assembly near the floor. Improvised. New. Not part of the original site. Someone had come here after Elian's signal and had not wanted easy access left behind. "Elian," Kalin said. "I see it." The captain worked in silence, gloved fingers steady despite the cold. He cut the wire, traced the mechanism, and pulled free a slim hooked blade hidden beneath fallen plaster. "Not Mountain Maid," he muttered. "Human. Recent." Belle felt anger this time, sharp enough to warm her blood. They had been followed by history's second generation, not just the ones who erased, but the ones who kept returning to maintain the erasure. Elian removed the last piece of the trap and stepped back. Safe. Kalin opened the first bronze cover. Inside were packets of sealed vellum, hardened with age but intact beneath waxed wrapping. The second compartment held smaller ledger books, brittle at the edges yet legible. The third was empty except for a single wooden box, dark with age, bound in cracked leather. Belle knew before touching it that this one mattered. Kalin looked at her once, then let her reach for it. The box was lighter than she expected. Inside lay 3 things. A ring bearing a symbol Belle did not recognize but that Kalin inhaled sharply at the sight of. A folded letter bound with faded blue thread, and a child's bracelet made of silver links too small for an adult wrist. Belle stared at the bracelet. Then, the world around her narrowed so suddenly she had to brace one hand against the stone wall. She knew it, not because she remembered wearing it in any clear image, but because some piece of the body remembers what the mind buries. The weight of it in the palm, the shape of the clasp, the tiny crescent notch in one link where it had once bent. Her bracelet, or one that had been made for her before she was old enough to understand possession. Kalin stepped closer, but did not touch her. "Belle." She could not answer. Her fingers closed around the bracelet slowly, reverently, like someone lifting proof that she had not imagined her own beginning. Elian had moved to the ledgers, giving them privacy without making a show of it. One of the outriders entered briefly to confirm the perimeter was still clear, then withdrew at Kalin's signal. Belle swallowed and forced herself to look at the folded letter. The outer page bore one name, Asher Vale. The handwriting was elegant, firm, and unmistakably personal. Not an official record, not a report. A letter. For a moment, Belle could not open it. Kalin said quietly, "You do not have to do it now." Belle shook her head. "No," she whispered. I do. She untied the thread with fingers that trembled only once. The letter inside had faded, but not enough to hide the words. My little star, if you are reading this, then time has done what it always does. It has taken my voice and left only what I could place into paper and hope. I do not know how old you are now, or who has kept you long enough for this to find you. I only know that if it has, then some mercy survived with us. Belle stopped reading for 1 second and closed her eyes. Her mother's voice did not return in sound, but it returned in shape. She kept going. You were never born to be hidden in shame. You were hidden because there were men afraid of what kindness could do when placed beside power. They called us dangerous because we reminded them strength without balance becomes ruin. Remember this when they try to tell you your existence brought chaos. It was never your existence. It was their fear. Tears blurred the next lines. Belle wiped them away with the back of her hand and kept reading because stopping would have hurt more. If Ravencrest still stands, then know this also. Not all of them betrayed us. One king refused. One line broke itself trying to keep a promise. There is guilt in that house. Yes, but there is also debt and love, and those who tried to choose rightly too late. If one of them stands beside you now in truth, do not punish him for the cowardice of dead men. Kalin's silence beside her changed. Belle felt it without looking up. The last lines were shorter, as though written under urgency. I named you Belle because even in a hunted winter, I wanted one beautiful thing to remain untouched by fear. Live long enough to choose your own life. That is all I have ever wanted for you. Your mother, Asher. Belle did not realize she was crying until a drop struck the page. The room had gone impossibly still. The mountain, the ruined shelves, the cold, the war waiting below the ridge. All of it receded before the unbearable, miraculous fact that her mother had not vanished wordlessly from the world. She had spoken. She had left something that reached across years of burial and lies, and found Belle anyway. Kalin did not speak first. He understood this was not the kind of grief or relief another voice should interrupt too quickly. Belle folded the letter carefully, but not before pressing her fingertips once over the signature. Asher. Her mother had been real in all the ways that mattered, not only in pain, in intention, in love, and for the first time in her life, Belle no longer felt like someone assembled out of disappearance. She felt inherited. The ledgers confirmed what the letter had already begun to reveal. Ashenmore had not vanished in a single purge. They had been hunted in waves, moved, concealed, traded between mercy and fear depending on which faction inside Ravencrest held influence at a given moment. But among the entries, one truth became impossible to ignore. The former king had indeed tried to maintain a protective covenant over the last surviving mediators. Not out of sentiment, but out of conviction. He had believed the realm would one day destroy itself if alpha power no longer recognized any counterweight but force. The council had opposed him. Quietly at first, then absolutely. Asher Vale had been among the final names protected under that covenant. Belle sat on a half-fallen stone bench, while Elian read key entries aloud in clipped summaries. Kalin stood near the compartment vaults, one hand braced against the wall as if the physical structure of the room could help contain the shape of what they were learning. There, Elian said, turning one page with careful gloves. Cross-reference to infant transfer. Belle looked up sharply. He passed the ledger to her. The entry was brief, coded in places, and written under a secondary seal. But one line was clear enough. Child transferred under Moon Passage to preserve maternal line. No destination was listed, no recipient named, but it was enough. Enough to prove Belle had been taken out deliberately, not lost in chaos. Enough to prove someone had chosen that she should live. Enough to prove her mother's final years had not been meaningless resistance, but part of an effort small, failing perhaps, but real to carry one bloodline beyond extinction. Belle touched the page as if the words might vanish. They saved me, she said. Not quite to anyone, Kalin answered quietly. Yes, there was no triumph in his voice. Only truth, and the ache that came with it. Belle looked at him then, at the man whose house had once both failed and fought for hers, at the bloodline tied to kings who had not done enough, but also to one king who had tried and died in the trying. At the complicated inheritance standing before her now in living form, the letter had said, "If one of them stands beside you now, in truth, do not punish him for the cowardice of dead men." Belle had not realized how tightly she had been holding some unnamed resentment until that moment loosened inside her. Not all the way. History did not absolve itself because one old king had chosen better than his counsel. But enough. Enough for her to see Ravencrest not only as the house that let Ashenmore fall, but also as the house where someone had once broken, trying to prevent that fall, and where one man now stood beside her without asking her to shrink for the comfort of power. Kalin must have seen the shift in her face. "What is it?" he asked. Belle looked down at the letter again, then back at him. "My mother was kinder than history." Something in his expression altered, not confusion, but recognition. "She left me anger," Belle said softly, "and proof. But she also left me permission not to turn all of it into vengeance." Kalin did not answer immediately. Perhaps because he understood too well what it meant when someone chose not to become the sharpest possible version of their wound. Elian closed the final ledger and said, with tact bordering on grace, "We should move. If whoever set the trap returns, I'd rather not be found debating dead philosophy." That almost made Belle laugh through the salt still drying on her face. Almost. They took what mattered. The letter, the bracelet, the ring, 3 ledgers, selected sealed packets likely tied to the Covenant records. The rest they rehidden as best they could, not out of reverence for secrecy, but because anything left obvious would invite a second erasure. Before leaving, Belle turned back once more at the threshold of the archive room. She had not found her mother alive. She had not found answers to everything. She had not even found certainty about who carried her out under Moon Passage. But she had found enough. Enough to know she had once been cherished. Enough to know she had not survived by accident. Enough to know that love had operated in secret on her behalf long before she was old enough to recognize it. For someone whose life had so often felt like the aftermath of loss, that was not a small thing. It was a foundation. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. The storm had not entirely passed, but the clouds were breaking at their edges, letting pale winter light spill over the upper ridges. Snowfields that had seemed dead gray on the ascent now held a faint silver glow, and the dark pines below no longer looked like warning alone. They looked like continuity. The descent should have felt easier after the discovery. Instead, the danger merely changed shape. Because halfway down the outer shelf, Elian raised one hand sharply and slid from his horse in the same motion. The outriders followed. Kalin turned in the saddle, already reading the shift in the air before anyone spoke. "What?" he said. Elian crouched beside the trail. Fresh prints. 3 riders. Coming up fast from below. Not ours. Kalin's face went cold at once. The trap had not been the end of it. Someone had indeed doubled back. Belle's pulse kicked hard, but not into panic. Not now, not after the letter. Strangely, she felt steadier than she had before entering the site. The past had given her something stronger than shock to stand on. Elian looked up. "If they see us here, they'll know the site yielded something. They probably already suspect," Kalin said. "Then we don't let them confirm it." The trail ahead forked 30 yards down one route, continuing toward the visible descent, the other cutting behind a stand of wind-bent pine and narrowing toward an old hunter's traverse almost lost beneath snowpack. Elian pointed. "Split sign." Kalin understood instantly. One outrider would continue with a visible supply wrap behind the main descent, drawing pursuit if seen. The rest would take the hidden traverse with Belle and the recovered materials. Dangerous in its own way, but better than allowing a direct interception. Belle saw the plan in the same breath and looked at Kalin. He gave the order without hesitation. It was over in seconds. One rider broke off, cloak bundle strapped high as decoy cargo. Hoofbeats thudded down the more open shelf path, deliberately careless enough to be heard. The rest of them turned hard into the pines and forced the horses onto the narrower traverse. For 10 brutal minutes, all that existed was control. Branches clawed at cloaks. Ice gave under hoof edges. Once Belle's mare slipped and recovered so sharply that pain shot through her knee against the saddle frame. Kalin was there instantly, one hand on the bridle, steadying the motion without breaking pace. He did not ask if she was all right. He knew better than to waste breath on reassurance in the middle of a fall line. Then, from somewhere beyond the ridge behind them, came the faint sound of pursuit shifting direction. They had taken the decoy. Elian exhaled once through his teeth. Good. Not safe. Only good. They rode another hour before stopping in a shallow hollow shielded by stone and trees. The outrider sent as bait rejoined them later, grinning grimly through frost. They followed me until the second ridge, he said. Lost their nerve when they hit the false ice shelf. Kalin clasped his shoulder once. You did well. It was only then, as the danger eased from immediate to remembered, that Belle felt her body start to shake. Not from fear, from release. Kalin saw it and moved close enough to shield her from the worst of the wind without making a display of it before the others. Elian, once again, found reasons to busy himself elsewhere. Belle let out one trembling breath and looked up at Kalin. That was almost very bad. Yes, he said, but it wasn't. No, the answer was simple, and this time, for once, simplicity felt earned. They had gone into buried snow and come back with proof. They had found the past before the past could be burned again. They had avoided interception, and Belle carried in her cloak the first real words her mother had ever left her. For the first time in a very long while, survival did not feel like merely delaying grief. It felt like winning something back. They returned to Ironhold at sunset. No public procession marked the arrival. No heralds announced success. Only the hidden machinery of gates opening under sealed instruction, stables clearing fast, and the inner guard tightening briefly before restoring the illusion that nothing at all had happened. That was how victories survived in compromised courts. Quietly first, Belle barely felt the cold by the time she stepped down from the saddle. Exhaustion had replaced it, deep and bone-heavy. But exhaustion could not erase what lay beneath her cloak. The bracelet rested in an inner pocket over her ribs. The folded letter was bound inside a protective leather case Kalin himself had secured before they rode out from the mountain shelf. Every few minutes, Belle found herself checking its presence with one hand, not because she feared losing it, but because her body had not yet adapted to the miracle of possessing it. Kalin did not call for immediate council session. That alone told Belle the journey had shifted him too. Before, he might have gone straight from danger into command, using motion to outrun everything else. Now he made a different choice. 2 hours, he told Sorrel after a concise debrief in the gate chamber. No summons unless the western line breaks. Sorrel looked almost startled. Then he bowed. Understood. Belle heard the significance in it. Kalin was making time, not taking it when convenient. Making it. He walked with her through the quieter inner corridors toward the private rooms near the old north wing, where fewer eyes intruded. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. The day had been too full for ordinary conversation, and neither one insulted the other by pretending otherwise. Inside the room assigned for her use, Belle finally loosened her gloves and cloak. Her fingers ached as warmth began stinging them back to life. Kalin closed the door behind them, then remained near it, as if uncertain whether he should stay, leave, speak first, or permit silence to do what words might bruise. Belle solved it for him. She took out the letter and set it carefully on the table between them. I want to read it again, she said. With you here. Something in Kalin's face changed, then not surprise, but a quietness deeper than restraint. If you are certain, I am. So she opened it once more. This time the words landed differently. The first reading had been shock, grief, proof, and the impossible force of hearing her mother reach across years. The second reading allowed meaning to settle where pure emotion had first flooded. You were never born to be hidden in shame. Belle read that line aloud and paused. All her life, some part of her had carried a stain she could never name. Not guilt exactly, more like inherited diminishment. The sense that her existence must have been an error someone had chosen not to speak about directly. But now those words stood against all of that like light against damp stone. Not hidden in shame, hidden because others were afraid. That difference mattered enough to reorder a life. She read on. They called us dangerous because we reminded them strength without balance becomes ruin. Kalin lowered his eyes briefly at that. Belle noticed. "My mother would have hated some of your counsel," she said softly. Kalin's mouth moved in what might have become a smile under easier circumstances. "Your mother sounds wiser than most of them," Belle continued. "If one of them stands beside you now, in truth, do not punish him for the cowardice of dead men." This time, when she reached that line, she stopped fully and looked up at him. Kalin did not look away. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Belle said, very quietly, "She wrote that before she could possibly know you." Kalin's gaze remained steady on her. Perhaps she knew the structure of the choice better than the names inside it. The answer struck her as exactly the kind of thing he would say after carrying too much history in one body for too long. Belle folded the letter carefully again. "It changes things." "Yes, not the war. No, not what the council will try next. No." She drew in a slow breath. "But it changes me." That, finally, made something in Kalin's composure soften. "How?" Belle rested both hands lightly against the table edge and thought before answering. She had spent so much of her life reacting, surviving, bracing. Naming an internal change felt stranger than naming danger. "It takes away the lie," she said. "The oldest one." He waited. "The lie that I came from ruin and could only ever become someone other people had to manage. My mother didn't leave me fear. She left me instruction." Belle looked down once at the letter. "To live long enough to choose my own life." Kalin's voice lowered. "And what do you choose?" It was the kind of question that, once asked sincerely, could no longer be answered with evasions. Belle lifted her head. "I choose not to let this court define Ashenmoor as a contagion. I choose not to let my mother remain a footnote in sealed ledgers. I choose not to spend the rest of my life hiding in gratitude just because survival once required silence." Kalin did not move. Belle's pulse rose anyway, because she knew there was one more truth beneath all the others. "And," she said, "I choose to stay beside the man who gave me room to make those choices myself." There it was. Not a dramatic confession, not wrapped in ornament, but clearer than anything softer could have been. For a second, the room held such stillness that Belle could hear the faint burn of the fire in the hearth. Kalin crossed the distance between them slowly, as if abruptness would damage something already delicate and strong at once. When he stopped, he was close enough that Belle could feel the warmth of him beneath the cold still clinging to his coat. "Belle," he said, and there was no kingship in his voice now, only the stripped gravity of a man who had spent too long fearing his own certainty. "If you stay beside me after all of this, then it will not be as burden, tool, or obligation." Belle looked up at him. "I know." His hand lifted not quickly, not possessively, and touched the side of her face, thumb just beneath the mark where cold had reddened her skin. It was the gentlest contact they had ever had, and because it came after everything else after war, buried records, trap wires, dead kings, mother's letters, and the refusal to reduce each other into something convenient, it felt more intimate than any hunger. "I have wanted to say too many things too early," Kalin admitted, voice roughened by honesty more than emotion. "And too few for too long." Belle's breath caught. "Then don't do either now," she whispered. Something like relief passed through his eyes. So he did not give her a speech, did not promise impossible futures, did not flood the moment with words meant to secure it against uncertainty. He only leaned down, slowly enough for her to stop it, and pressed his forehead to hers. The contact was simple, still, human. Belle closed her eyes. For one suspended moment, it felt as if the entire architecture of fear around them had stepped back half a pace. Not gone, not defeated, but no longer sovereign over everything. When Kalin finally drew away, his hand lingered once at her cheek before falling. It was enough, more than enough. Outside, the West still threatened. Inside Ironhold, enemies still rearranged themselves. But here, in this room, something had settled into truth without violence. And truth, Belle was beginning to understand, was the first form of peace some lives were ever allowed. The next morning began with resistance. Of course it did. No meaningful victory ever remained unchallenged for long inside Ironhold, and the quiet success of the mountain mission only made counter-movement inevitable. By breakfast, Whispers had already begun to circulate that the king had left sealed operations in unknown hands for too many hours. By mid-morning, Chancellor Vielle had requested an emergency consult regarding procedural transparency in wartime command. By noon, Vina Hale had reappeared with perfect poise and the unreadable calm of someone who had decided watching would now be more useful than pushing. Belle, surprisingly, did not dread it. That was the first sign the letter had changed her more than exhaustion had yet revealed. She still recognized danger, still mistrusted half the faces in council chambers, still knew that many of them would have preferred her voiceless, placeless, or gone. But dread had less grip now, because dread thrived best in those who feared they had no rightful ground to stand on. Belle had ground now, not granted by court, not bestowed by Kalin, rooted deeper, by blood, by record, by love carried forward. The smaller war chamber filled quickly. Vielle, Sorel, 2 logistics advisors, 1 archivist brought in at Kalin's order, and Vina. Belle stood at Kalin's side openly this time, not daring them to object, but simply making objection too late to matter. Vielle spoke first, because men like him always mistook initiative for control. My king, with Western movement increasing, any unlogged excursion by Crown-affiliated personnel invites confusion at minimum and manipulation at worst. Kalin sat at the head of the table, blade laid flat beside him not as threat, but as statement. Then perhaps you should begin by asking why your concern sharpens only after successful returns. Vielle did not flinch. Successful according to what record? Belle nearly smiled. There it was. The obvious opening. Kalin did not take it. He looked at Belle. A year ago, a month ago, perhaps even a week ago, that gesture would have shocked the room. Today it did something more useful. It made them wait. Belle stepped forward and placed the recovered ring and one of the ledgers on the table. The archivist inhaled sharply at once. Vina's eyes narrowed by less than a degree. Vielle's face went very still. According to record, Belle said. This one. Silence spread. The archivist, an older woman named Saray, whom Kalin had summoned specifically because she was too respected in technical matters to be easily shouted down, moved closer with reverent care. She examined the ring first, then the ledger seal. This crest, she murmured. It predates the post-purge council standard. Say it clearly, Kalin said. Saray looked up. It is legitimate. Vielle's shoulders tightened almost invisibly. Belle opened the ledger to the covenant entries and turned it so the room could see. She did not reveal every page. Some things were still too dangerous to lay before uncertain eyes, but she revealed enough. The protective covenant reference, the infant transfer line, the former king's countersigned notation refusing final surrender of the Ashenmore line to council custody. Every face in the room changed, not all in the same way. Sorel looked grim, as men of action often do when politics finally becomes documented treachery rather than intuition. The logistics advisors looked alarmed, because institutional guilt always frightened bureaucrats more than enemy swords. Vina became unreadable in a more complete sense than before, and Vielle looked exactly like a man watching the floor shift under an argument he had planned to stand on all day. Kalin spoke only after the silence had ripened fully. You asked for procedural clarity, he said. Now you have historical clarity as well. Vielle recovered enough to say, historical records can be interpreted, Belle answered before irritation could become strategy. Not the existence of the covenant, not the survival of the line, and not the fact that some within Ravencrest preserved what others tried to erase. Vielle turned to her. Selective presentation is also interpretation. Yes, Belle said evenly, which is why I am being selective. Because unlike some men in this room, I do not intend to hand every surviving fragment of my bloodline's history to whoever next decides it should be extinguished properly this time. That ended the line of attack more thoroughly than outrage would have. Because she had not asked permission, she had stated terms, and she had done it in the language of evidence, not emotion. Vina was the one who finally tilted the chamber in Belle's favor completely. The question before us, she said, hands folded with perfect composure, is no longer whether Belle represents irregular influence, The record appears to establish that Ravencrest itself historically entered covenant with her line. Every eye shifted. Vina continued. Whatever one thinks of the past, the optics now are different. To move against her without cause would no longer look like stabilizing wartime command. It would look like repeating documented bad faith. Belle almost laughed at the irony of being defended, however pragmatically, by the same woman who had once spoken of control as necessity. But politics rarely produced pure allies, only converging interests. Vael knew he was cornered, not defeated forever, but cornered now. His final effort came in a drier, narrower form. Then what is proposed? Kalin answered this time. A formal restoration of crown protection under revived covenant authority, he said. Belle Thane will be recognized as protected under Ravencrest's direct historical obligation, pending wartime resolution. The room stilled again. This was not romance-made policy, not whim, not soft favoritism. It was brilliant. By framing Belle not as exceptional indulgence but as the living subject of an old covenant obligation, Kalin had done three things at once. He legitimized her place. He bound the court publicly against easy removal. And he transformed her from destabilizing irregularity into restored continuity. Vial understood exactly how effective it was. That was why his face hardened. Sarah, the archivist, bowed her head. From a record standpoint, the restoration is defensible, Sorel added. From a military standpoint, it reduces internal ambiguity. Vina said nothing. She did not need to. The chamber had already shifted. Kalin looked to Belle once more. Not for permission, not even for agreement. Something quieter than that. Acknowledgement. Belle met it steadily. At last, Cullen said, "Then it is done." And just like that, what the council had feared in whispers was rewritten in the authority of the throne itself, not erased, named differently, claimed properly. Belle felt the change at once. Not because anything in the room suddenly grew warm, but because power had just been forced to speak of her in a language other than contamination. It did not heal everything, but it was a beginning large enough to matter. When the session ended, Vielle left first, too quickly. Sorel lingered long enough to bow not to Belle as one bows to royalty, but with measured respect. Sarah requested temporary custody of copied pages for authentication protocols and nearly trembled with professional fury at the scale of what had been hidden from the archives. Vina gave Belle a long look at the door. "You continue to alter the shape of rooms," she said. Belle answered, "I'm learning from the best." For the first time, Vina almost smiled. Then she was gone. When only Belle and Kalin remained, she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. That went better than expected. Kalin rose from his chair and came around the table. "That is because expectations in this castle are usually designed by cowards." Belle huffed out a tired laugh. Then Kalin stopped in front of her and said, "Lower. You were extraordinary." Belle lifted one brow. "That sounds dangerously close to praise." "It is praise. Publicly? No. A beat. Privately. With considerable intent." That did make her laugh. And the sound of it small, real, alive inside a room that had so often held only strategy and strain felt like another kind of victory altogether. The good turn did not remain purely domestic for long. By late afternoon, word arrived that the Western Confederate advance had overextended near Grey Fen. Not disastrously, not in the way storytellers like to frame battle, but enough. Weeks of pressure tactics had been built on one assumption. Ravencrest would continue spending as much energy questioning itself as resisting external force. What the Western Command had not anticipated was the speed with which Kalin could convert inner uncertainty into harder alignment once given solid ground to do so. The revived Covenant order, though formally internal, had immediate effect. Command hesitation lessened. Courier lanes stabilized. 3 captains previously wavering between political caution and field decisiveness now committed fully to Sorel's western defense line. Most importantly, the lower ranks stopped whispering incompatible versions of the same rumor and began repeating one that was far more useful. The king had uncovered treachery inside the court, restored an old obligation, and was now moving against enemies within and without. Singular narrative. Just as Vina had said, soldiers needed. Only this time, the narrative was not a lie. That mattered. At dusk, Sorrel returned to the war hall with the first genuinely hopeful report in days. Grey Fen had held. A Western supply incursion had been intercepted and driven back. The Confederate center, expecting continued uncertainty, had pushed too far into marsh-fractured ground and lost formation. Nothing decisive, but enough to prove that the enemy's timing advantage had weakened. When Sorrel finished, Kalin looked not triumphant, but sharpened. "Pressure them at the edges," he said. "Not enough to draw a countercharge. Enough to make them feel the line is no longer soft." Sorrel nodded. "It will be done." Belle stood to one side of the hall and watched the shift happen in real time. Not magic. Not miracle. Just the profound strategic value of a court no longer wasting its strongest hours pretending one of its central truths did not exist. Kalin's commanders left the chamber carrying clearer orders than they had in days. When the hall emptied, Belle walked slowly toward the table where the Western markers had been adjusted. "They're losing rhythm," she said. Kalin looked at the map. Yes, because they were counting on the court to keep bleeding into itself. Yes, Belle let herself feel it then. Relief. Not complete. Not safe. The war was not over, and both of them knew better than to dress improvement as final victory. But the line had turned. Slightly. Meaningfully. Enough to change morale, which in turn changed decisions, which in turn changed outcomes. In stories, people often imagined happy endings as the absence of threat. Real ones were rarer and stranger. Sometimes a happy turn was simply the moment when threat stopped controlling every direction at once. Belle touched the table edge and smiled faintly. "My mother would have enjoyed the irony." Kalin's gaze shifted to her. "Which part?" "That the people who spent years trying to erase balance are now being saved by it." This time he did smile. Clearly. Briefly. But clearly. And because she had waited so long to see it without shadow, it felt almost like another letter from the past, unexpected proof that some beautiful things did survive winter. That night, for the first time since everything had begun to unravel, Ironhold felt almost quiet. Not safe. Not healed. But quiet in the honest way a fortress becomes quiet after choosing its footing again. The corridors carried fewer frantic steps. The watch bells changed in ordinary rhythm rather than alarm sequence. Even the wind beyond the towers sounded different, less like warning and more like weather returning to its proper work. Belle stood on the north terrace wrapped in her cloak, the bracelet hidden beneath it, resting warm now against her wrist where she had fastened it again. She had hesitated before doing so. The silver links were small and old, and for a moment fastening them had felt like trespassing into her own infancy. But once it closed around her skin, something settled. Not completion. Nothing that clean. But belonging. She heard Kalin before she turned. He approached without armor this time, wearing only dark winter layers and the residual fatigue of a man who had carried too much command for too many days. Yet there was something lighter in him now, too. Not ease exactly, more like the absence of one specific weight that had pressed on him so long he had forgotten its shape until it lifted. "You should be inside," he said. Belle looked out over the moonlit line of the outer walls. "So should you, probably." Neither moved toward the door. Below them, Ironhold spread in layered shadow and silver torchlight. Beyond it, the western darkness remained what it was, unresolved. Patient. Real. But the citadel no longer felt like a place caving inward around secrets. It felt like a place holding. Kalin came to stand beside her. For a while, they said nothing. Then Belle reached into her cloak and drew out the letter once more. Not to read it fully, only to hold it in both hands and look at the folded page as though reassurance could still be taken from its existence alone. She wanted one beautiful thing to remain untouched by fear, Belle said quietly. Kalin's voice was low. "Did it?" Belle thought about it. About Dunhallow. About the years of not knowing. About the council. The arena. The trap. The pursuit. The war. Then about the bracelet on her wrist. The letter in her hands. The covenant restored. The western line turning. And the man standing beside her, not because fate had caged either of them into it, but because both had chosen, repeatedly, not to step away. At first, no, Belle said. Then, she looked at him. But maybe fear doesn't win simply because it touches a thing. Kalin turned slightly toward her. Maybe, Belle continued, it loses when the thing survives, becoming more than fear wanted it to be. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, your mother would approve of you. The words struck deeper than praise ever could have. Belle looked back down at the letter, blinking once against sudden heat in her eyes. I hope so. She would. Belle laughed softly under her breath. That sounded suspiciously certain for a man who never makes promises lightly. I am not promising. Kalin lifted one hand and touched, very gently, the bracelet at her wrist. I am observing evidence. That made her smile. A real one. Unforced, unshadowed for one full breath. Kalin's hand remained where it was a moment longer, thumb brushing the old silver link with the crescent notch. Then his fingers shifted, not to take her wrist, only to invite her hand into his. Belle let him. Their hands fit together simply. No theater, no witness, no need for any. Behind them, the fortress stood. Ahead of them, the war still waited. Above them, winter stars burned with the hard brightness only cold skies could hold. And yet, in that moment, the world felt neither cruel nor temporary, only true. Belle leaned lightly into his shoulder, and Kalin accepted the weight as if he had been waiting a long time to learn how. They stood that way for a while, saying nothing, because nothing needed saying. Below, Raven Crest held. Inside, the court had failed to erase her. In her hands, her mother's love had survived. At her side, the future had not resolved, but it had opened. That was not the end of war, not the end of danger, not the end of the story. But it was a happy ending for this part in the truest sense. Not because darkness had vanished, but because love, memory, legitimacy, and choice had all endured it. And for one clear winter night in Ironhold, that was enough.